Imagine a world where owning a car wasn't just expensive, it was absurd. Picture this. It's 1896. You walk into a workshop, not a showroom, because showrooms don't exist yet. The air smells of oil and wood shavings. In the corner sits something that barely resembles what we'd call an automobile. It's the Duryea motor wagon, and it's being assembled by hand. Piece by careful piece. 12 to 18 hours. That's how long it takes skilled craftsmen, not factory workers, craftsmen, to build a single vehicle. The price? $2,000. Now, $2,000 might not sound like much until you adjust for inflation. In today's money, that's $70,000. For something that barely works. For something that terrifies horses, breaks down constantly, and can't go faster than a decent trot. This wasn't transportation. This was a statement. A very expensive, very unreliable statement that you had money to burn. Only the top 1% of Americans could even consider buying one. Everyone else? They stuck with horses. Horses, at least you could trust. But let's say you were part of that elite 1%. Let's say you actually bought one of these contraptions. What did you get? Well, if you bought an Oldsmobile Curve Dash in 1901, one of the more reliable models, you got something assembled in a shed over the course of 20 hours. Not a factory. A shed? And when I say assembled, I mean it loosely. These vehicles were essentially hand-stitched together. Every bolt was fitted individually. Every component was custom-matched to its neighbor. There was no standardization, no interchangeable parts, no efficiency. And the performance. The Oldsmobile Curve Dash could reach a blistering 10 miles per hour. 10? That's jogging speed. But speed wasn't really the problem. The problem was that it broke down. Constantly. The roads were dirt and mud, full of ruts and stones. These early cars had wooden wheels, primitive suspensions, and engines that seemed to resent being turned on. Frequent breakdowns weren't an inconvenience, they were a given. You didn't go for a drive, you went for an adventure in mechanical failure. So cars remained toys. Hobbies for wealthy enthusiasts who enjoyed tinkering as much as traveling. The automobile wasn't transforming society. It was amusing a tiny sliver of it. Now, it gets even more chaotic because in 1900, nobody even agreed on what kind of cars should exist. Gasoline engines. Sure, those were one option. But they were loud, smelly, and required a hand crank that could break your arm if the engine backfired. Steam-powered cars, like the Stanley Steamer, were actually more popular. They were quieter, smoother, and more powerful. But they took 30 minutes to build up steam pressure before you could drive. 30 minutes of just waiting. Every time. And then there were the electric cars. The Baker Electric, for instance, was elegant, silent, and perfect for city driving. Except for one tiny problem, the batteries weighed 200 pounds and gave you maybe 20 miles of range. 20 miles. Then you needed to recharge, which took hours. So you had three competing technologies, none of them practical, all of them expensive, and all of them confined to people who could afford to experiment. There was no right answer. No dominant design. Just a bunch of wealthy hobbyists arguing about whether steam, electric, or gasoline was the future. Meanwhile, 95% of Americans were still using horses. Let me give you a sense of just how small this industry was. By 1908, more than a decade after the first automobiles appeared, the entire United States produced just 4,200 cars per year. Total. 4,200 vehicles for a country of 90 million people. And here's the really telling statistic. Repair shops outnumbered car owners 10 to 1. 10 repair shops for every single person who owned a car. Why? Because there were no standard parts. If something broke, and things broke constantly, you couldn't just order a replacement. You had to custom fabricate it. Every repair was bespoke. Every fix was a small manufacturing project. This meant owning a car required not just wealth, but access to skilled mechanics who could essentially rebuild parts from scratch. And the luxury prices. We're talking $4,000 and up for the fancier models. In today's money, that's well over $100,000. These weren't vehicles. They were mechanical pets that required constant, expensive care. But there was one glimmer of hope. One hint that maybe, just maybe, this chaos could be tamed. His name was Ransom Olds, and in 1901 he tried something different. Instead of having craftsmen build entire cars from start to finish, Olds organized his factory into something resembling an assembly process. Different stations, different tasks, components moving from one place to another. It was crude. It was rudimentary. But it worked. Using this semi-assembly method, Old slashed production time to an hour and a half per vehicle. Hour and a half, down from 12 to 18 hours. His factory built 425 units. 425 cars in a year when most manufacturers built dozens. This was a breakthrough. This was the future knocking on the door. And then, fire. A massive fire destroyed Old's factory, destroyed the progress, destroyed the machinery and the momentum. The experiment ended almost as soon as it began. And the lesson seemed clear. This industry was too fragile, too chaotic, too dependent on single points of failure. Olds rebuilt, but the magic was gone. The chaos returned. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Europeans had a completely different philosophy about automobiles. In 1906, Rolls-Royce introduced the Silver Ghost, a handcrafted masterpiece. Every component was individually fitted. Every surface was polished to perfection. Every vehicle was, quite literally, bespoke. The price? £985. In today's money, roughly $50,000. But Rolls-Royce wasn't trying to build affordable transportation. They were building mobile art. Vehicles for aristocrats who wanted the finest engineering money could buy. And this philosophy dominated Europe. Quality over quantity. Craftsmanship over efficiency. Luxury over volume. It was beautiful. It was elegant. And it meant that automobiles would remain forever confined to the wealthy elite. The European approach essentially guaranteed that cars would never be for the masses. They didn't want them to be. That wasn't the point. But even for those who could afford cars, there was a darker reality. They were death traps. In 1900, automobiles killed over 500 people. 500 deaths from maybe a few thousand vehicles on the road. Why? Because nothing was reliable. Brakes failed. Steering failed. Wheels collapsed. Engines caught fire. And remember, there were no paved roads. You were driving these unreliable machines on dirt, mud, gravel, surfaces designed for horses, not motorized vehicles. Every trip was a gamble. Would you arrive safely? Would something break? Would you lose control on a muddy curve and crash? There were no safety standards, no regulations, no testing. Just wealthy enthusiasts piloting experimental machines on roads that weren't built for them. And because there were no interchangeable parts, even basic repairs became nightmares. A broken axle didn't mean ordering a replacement, it meant custom fabricating one. A cracked engine block could mean weeks of work. Owning a car wasn't just expensive. It was dangerous and impractical and exhausting. There was one more glimmer of progress before everything changed. In 1908, during the famous Selden patent lawsuit, an investor named Henry Leland did something remarkable. He demonstrated that Cadillac parts could be truly interchangeable. Leland took 3 Cadillacs, completely disassembled them, mixed all the parts together in a pile, and then reassembled 3 working vehicles using random parts from the pile. It worked. Every part fit. Every vehicle ran. This proved that standardization was possible. That manufacturing didn't have to be chaos. That parts didn't need to be custom fitted by skilled craftsmen. But even Cadillac only produced about 2,000 cars that year. And the vehicles still cost a fortune. Interchangeable parts were proven. But they weren't yet changing the industry. So here's where we stood in the early 1900s. 95% of American transportation was still horse-drawn. Horses, carriages, wagons. These are what people trusted. What people could afford. What actually worked? Automobiles? They were curiosities. Expensive, unreliable curiosities for people who had money and time to waste. The industry was fragmented. Steam versus gasoline versus electric. Hand-built versus semi-assembly. Custom parts versus the dream of standardization. There was no dominant player. No clear path forward. Just a bunch of small manufacturers building a few hundred cars each, charging luxury prices, and hoping someone would buy them. And then 1907 hit. The panic of 1907. A financial crisis that swept through America, shuttering businesses, destroying fortunes, and highlighting just how fragile this infant industry was. Auto factories closed. Orders vanished. The whole experiment seemed on the verge of collapse. Without scale, without efficiency, without affordability, automobiles would remain toys. Period pieces in history. Footnotes to the era of horses. But somewhere in Detroit, a man named Henry Ford was watching this chaos. And he was thinking differently. While Rolls-Royce built masterpieces for aristocrats, Ford was thinking about farmers. While others built hundreds of cars for thousands of dollars, Ford was imagining millions of cars for hundreds of dollars. While the industry accepted that automobiles would always be luxury items, Ford believed they should belong to everyone. The chaos of the early automobile industry wasn't a problem to accept. It was a problem to solve. And Henry Ford, whether the world knew it yet or not, was about to solve it. Not with better craftsmanship, not with fancier designs, not with more powerful engines, but with something far more revolutionary, the assembly line. The age of chaos was about to end. The age of mass production was about to begin. And nothing, not transportation, not industry, not society itself, would ever be the same. October 1st, 1908. A date that should be as famous as July 4th, 1776, because on this day, something fundamentally American was born. Not a nation this time, but an idea made metal. The Model T. $850. That was the price. Not $2,000. Not $4,000. $850. Still expensive for the average worker, yes? But for the first time in automotive history, the price tag didn't immediately disqualify 99% of the population. This wasn't a luxury vehicle for the wealthy elite. This was a car with a purpose, to be owned by everyone. 20 horsepower from a 177 cubic inch engine. Top speed of 45 miles per hour. Simple, reliable, practical, and had a nickname that would become more famous than most human beings, Tin Lizzie. Over the next 19 years, Henry Ford would sell 15 million of them. 15 million. Not 1,500. Not 15,000. 15 million. To put that in perspective, Ford didn't just dominate the automobile market. He essentially was the automobile market. Now, there's a quote attributed to Henry Ford that everyone knows, even if they don't know it's about the Model T. Any customer can have a car painted any color that he wants, so long as it is black. People usually laugh at this. They think Ford was being stubborn or controlling or lacking imagination. But that's not what this quote is about at all. Black paint dried faster than any other color. Hours faster. Which meant black cars could move through the production line faster. Which meant Ford could build more cars per day. Which meant lower cost per vehicle. Which meant lower prices. Every Model T being black wasn't about aesthetics. It was about efficiency. It was about affordability. It was about making cars accessible to people who'd never dreamed of owning one. Ford didn't care if his cars were beautiful. He cared if working families could afford them. And that philosophy, that ruthless prioritization of function over form, of speed over style, of accessibility over elegance, that's what separated Ford from every other manufacturer on Earth. See, Henry Ford didn't grow up wealthy. He grew up on a farm in Michigan. He knew what it was like to work with your hands, to earn $2 a day doing backbreaking labor, to watch the sun rise and set over fields that needed plowing. And he remembered what it felt like to dream of something better. Ford's vision wasn't abstract. It was personal. He wanted the farm workers, the factory laborers, the shop clerks, people like his parents, people like he'd been, to own cars. Not someday. Not when they got rich. No. With the money they were already earning. So Ford created a payment plan, $5 installments. $5 at a time, a worker earning $2 a day could slowly, steadily own a Model T. Think about what this meant. For the first time in history, the automobile wasn't a rich man's toy. It was a working man's tool. A family's freedom. A farmer's ticket to the wider world. Ford took a luxury item and made it a necessity. He flipped the entire paradigm of what cars were supposed to be. And America responded. By 1914, just 6 years after the Model T launched, Ford's creation comprised 48% of all car sales in the United States. 48%. Nearly half of every car sold in America was a Model T. Imagine that kind of market dominance. Imagine one product being so perfectly designed, so perfectly priced, so perfectly suited to people's needs that it just wins. Overwhelmingly. And part of what made the Model T so successful was how easy it was to drive. Remember, most Americans had never driven anything. They'd ridden horses, steered wagons, but operating a motorized vehicle with gears and levers and pedals? That was alien. Ford simplified everything. The Model T had a planetary transmission, basically a simpler gearing system that was easier to understand and harder to break. It had magneto ignition, which meant no complicated electrical systems to fail. You didn't need to be a mechanic to drive a Model T. You just needed to be willing to try. This was democratization in action. Ford wasn't just making cars affordable, he was making them accessible, usable, reliable enough that a farmer with no mechanical training could drive to town and back without fear of breaking down. But here's what truly set Ford apart. He didn't just assemble cars. He controlled everything. Vertical integration, they call it now. But back then, it was revolutionary. Ford didn't buy steel from suppliers. He owned iron or mines. He mined his own ore. Ford didn't purchase glass from manufacturers. He built his own glass factories. Ford didn't contract tire production. He made his own tires. By controlling every step of the supply chain, Ford cut costs by 60%. 60%. Every dollar saved was a dollar he could pass on to customers in the form of lower prices. And lower prices meant more people could afford Model Ts. And more sales meant more volume. And more volume meant even greater efficiency. It was a virtuous cycle that competitors couldn't match because they didn't control their inputs the way Ford did. And through it all, Ford had one guiding star. One mission statement that drove every decision. I will build a motor car for the great multitude, not for the wealthy, not for the elite, for the multitude, for everyone. That wasn't just marketing. That was his obsession. Now, nothing lasts forever. Not even the Model T. By the mid-1920s, something strange was happening. Sales were still strong, but the enthusiasm was fading. People loved their Model Ts, but they'd been driving the same basic design for nearly 20 years. Competitors were offering new features, more comfort, better styling. And for the first time, customers were starting to wonder, what else is out there? Ford resisted change. He didn't want to abandon the formula that had made him the richest man in America. Why fix what isn't broken? But eventually, even Henry Ford had to admit, it was time. In 1927, Ford introduced the Model A new design, a nickel steel body for durability, 40 horsepower, double the Model T, and a starting price of $385. It wasn't as revolutionary as the Model T, but it was better in almost every measurable way. Faster, stronger, more comfortable. And customers responded. Over the next few years, Ford sold 4.8 million Model A vehicles. Not 15 million like the T. But still, nearly 5 million people chose Ford's new vision. But the Model T's impact wasn't confined to America. By the 1920s, Ford was exporting cars globally. 2 million Model Ts found their way to foreign shores, to Europe, to Asia, to South America. Everywhere roads existed or could be built, Model Ts appeared. And something interesting happened in Japan. Local manufacturers saw the Model T and thought, we can make something like this. Early Japanese automakers, companies like Datsun, which would eventually become part of Nissan, created knockoffs. Not exact copies, but inspired designs. Simpler vehicles based on Ford's blueprint. Ford responded by setting up local assembly plants. Why let others profit from his design when he could just build the cars there himself? This wasn't just business expansion. This was Ford understanding that the automobile revolution was global. That every country, every culture, every economy would eventually need affordable transportation. And Ford wanted to be there first. Let's talk about just how affordable the Model T became. In 1924, Ford sold the Model T for $290. $290. Remember when it launched in 1908? It cost $850. By 1924, Ford had driven the price down by two-thirds. $290 was less than many workers' monthly wages. You could save for a few months and buy a car outright. No installments needed. This was the peak. The moment when automobiles truly became accessible to the masses. Rural America especially was transformed. Farmers who'd lived their entire lives within a 10-mile radius of their homes suddenly had mobility. They could drive to town, visit neighbors 20 miles away, take their crops to better markets. The Model T didn't just change transportation. It changed geography. It changed social structures. It changed what was possible for millions of people who'd never had options before. Distance stopped being a prison. The Model T was the key. Ford's genius wasn't just in affordability, it was in simplicity through standardization. The original Model T had about 10,000 parts. 10,000 individual components that needed to be manufactured, assembled, and maintained. Ford looked at that number and asked, how many of these are actually necessary? Through relentless standardization and simplification, Ford reduced complexity. Fewer unique parts meant fewer things to manufacture. Fewer things to manufacture meant lower costs and faster production. And crucially, fewer parts meant easier repairs. A farmer in rural Kansas could fix his Model T with basic tools because the parts were simple and standardized. You didn't need a specialist. You didn't need expensive equipment. You just needed a wrench and some determination. This repairability extended the life of every Model T cars that might have been scrapped after a few years lasted decades because owners could maintain them. Ford wasn't just selling cars, he was selling independence. There's a story about Henry Ford and the first Model T that captures everything about his philosophy. Ford had just finished building one of the first prototypes. It was ready. It worked. But nobody really knew if it would hold up to real-world conditions. So Ford did something characteristically bold. He drove it himself. He climbed into that first Model T and drove from his factory to the Detroit news office. Not on smooth roads. Remember, this was 1908. The roads were rough, rutted, muddy, basically dirt paths with delusions of grandeur. Ford could have shipped the car, could have had someone else test it, could have stayed in his office and waited for reports. But that wasn't his style. He believed in his creation, and he was going to prove it worked by putting himself in the driver's seat. And it worked. The Model T made it to the Detroit news without breaking down. Ford stepped out, and the story, both the literal journey and the metaphorical one, began. That drive wasn't just a test. It was a statement. This car is tough enough for American roads, reliable enough for American families, ready enough to change the world. So let's step back and see what Ford accomplished with the Model T. He took a luxury item that cost thousands and made it cost hundreds. He took a complicated machine that required expert knowledge and made it simple enough for anyone to operate. He took an industry built on handcrafted exclusivity and transformed it into mass production accessibility. 15 million Model Ts, nearly half the American car market at its peak. $290 by 1924. Global exports reaching millions. This wasn't just a successful product. This was a revolution. But here's what's really remarkable. Ford didn't achieve this through better engineering or superior craftsmanship. Other manufacturers built faster cars, more comfortable cars, more elegant cars. Ford achieved this through philosophy. I will build a motor car for the great multitude. Every decision flowed from that single principle. Black paint because it dried faster. Simple transmission because people weren't mechanics. Vertical integration because controlling costs meant serving customers. Standardized parts because repairability meant longevity. Ford understood something that his competitors didn't. The biggest market wasn't the wealthy. It was everyone else. And if you could serve everyone else, you didn't need to be the fanciest. You just needed to be the most accessible. The Model T gave farmers freedom. It gave workers dignity. It gave families possibilities they'd never imagined. It turned "someday I'll own a car" into "I'm driving to town tomorrow." That's not just business success. That's societal transformation. But Ford wasn't done. Because as revolutionary as affordable cars were, Ford understood that you couldn't just make cars cheaper, you had to make them faster. Not faster to drive, faster to build. And that meant revolutionizing not just the product, but the entire process of how it was made. The assembly line was calling. 1913, Highland Park, Michigan. Inside Henry Ford's factory, something is about to happen that will change not just the automobile industry, not just American manufacturing, but the entire structure of modern civilization. A Model T chassis sits at one end of a massive room. Usually, a team of skilled workers would surround it, spending 12.5 hours assembling the vehicle piece by piece. But today is different. Today, that chassis is attached to a moving chain. And as it begins to glide slowly across the factory floor, workers stationed along its path don't move with it. They stay in place. Each one has a single task. One part to add, one bolt to tighten, one component to install. The chassis keeps moving. Worker after worker adds their piece. 45 process steps, 45 stations, and 93 minutes later, not 12.5 hours, but 93 minutes, a complete Model T chassis emerges at the other end. The assembly line had been born, and the world would never be the same. Now, Henry Ford didn't invent the assembly line out of thin air. He was inspired by something most people would never connect to automobile manufacturing. Meatpacking plants in Chicago. Stay with me here. Ford visited Chicago slaughterhouses and watched something fascinating. Carcasses moving on overhead conveyors past workers who each performed one specific cut, one specific task. The meat kept moving. The workers stayed put. And incredibly quickly, a whole animal was processed into parts. Ford looked at this and had an epiphany. What if we reversed it? Instead of taking something apart on a moving line, what if we put something together? He also studied slide rules and timing mechanisms, anything that could measure precision and efficiency. Because Ford understood that speed without precision was chaos. But precision with speed? That was revolution. So Ford designed a system where the chassis, the skeleton of the car, would be pulled by a conveyor belt past 140 stations. Each worker would be fixed in place, performing one specialized task. Install flywheels. 1 minute. Attach the radiator. 45 seconds. Bolt down the engine. 2 minutes. Every action was timed. Every movement was optimized. Nothing was wasted. Let's talk about one specific example. Magneto assembly. A magneto is a component that generates electrical current for the engine's ignition. It has 29 parts. Small parts. Fiddly parts. Parts that need to fit together precisely. Before the assembly line, one skilled worker would sit at a bench and assemble an entire magneto from start to finish. This took 20 hours. 20 hours per magneto. On the assembly line, Ford broke magneto assembly into specialized steps spread across multiple workers. Each person handled a few parts, performed a few actions, then the partially assembled magneto moved to the next station. Result? 13 minutes. Down from 20 hours to 13 minutes. That's not incremental improvement. That's transformation. And it wasn't just about speed. Ford integrated vertical processes right into the line. Flywheels, heavy metal components, were poured on-site rather than transported from external suppliers. Why ship heavy flywheels across the city when you can cast them in the same building where they'll be installed? Save time. Save money. Eliminate transportation delays. Every inefficiency was a target. Every wasted second was an enemy. But the genius wasn't just in the moving line. It was in the support systems Ford built around it. Parts didn't arrive by workers walking to storage rooms and carrying them back. That would slow everything down. Instead, Ford installed gravity chutes and overhead trolleys. Parts flowed to workers automatically. Drop a chute, and bolts slide down right to your workstation. Look up, and the component you need is hanging on a trolley, ready to grab. Ford and his engineers ran over 2,000 experiments. 2,000 attempts to refine the flow, optimize the spacing, perfect the timing. They tested different conveyor speeds, different station arrangements, different handoff points, and gradually, through relentless iteration, they got it right. By 1914, Highland Park was producing 1,000 Model Ts per day. 1,000. From a factory that had previously struggled to build 100. Output increased tenfold not through working harder, but through working smarter. But none of this would work without precision. Because if parts don't fit perfectly, the line stops. And if the line stops, you lose everything. So Ford invested heavily in precision tools. Drill jigs that ensured every hole was drilled in exactly the right place. Templates that guaranteed consistent measurements. Quality control checkpoints that caught defects before they traveled down the line. The line moved at 6 feet per minute. Not fast enough to exhaust workers, but fast enough that there was no time for dawdling. You performed your task, and the chassis moved on. And if you performed your task perfectly, bonuses. Ford paid workers extra for accuracy and speed. Because a defect down the line was expensive to fix. Prevention was cheaper than correction. This created a culture of precision. Workers weren't just assembling cars, they were being held accountable for quality at every single station. December 1st, 1913. That's the day the first moving assembly line for ignition systems came online. Not the full chassis yet, that was still being assembled the old way. But ignition systems flowed down a moving line, proving the concept. Workers gathered to watch. Some were skeptical. Some were nervous. This was so different from anything they'd ever done. But it worked. Parts flowed. Workers adapted. The line moved. And then, on New Year's Day 1914, the full assembly line launched. The complete chassis moving from start to finish on a continuous chain. It was magnificent. It was terrifying. And it fundamentally changed what it meant to work in a factory. Workers initially resisted the speed up. Going from 12 hours to 90 minutes meant working faster, repeating the same motion hundreds of times per day. It was monotonous, exhausting in a different way than before. Some quit. Some complained. Ford had to adjust wages and conditions to retain workers, but we'll get to that in the next segment. For now, the point is, the line worked. Despite resistance, despite skepticism, despite the enormous change it represented, the assembly line was here to stay. But Ford wasn't satisfied with just Highland Park. He had a vision for something even bigger. In 1927, Ford opened the River Rouge complex. And calling it a factory doesn't do it justice. This was an industrial empire. 9 million square feet. 9,120,000 workers. Not just assembling cars, but doing everything. Smelting iron ore into steel. Forging that steel into parts. Manufacturing glass. Producing rubber. River Rouge had its own steel mill integrated directly into the assembly line. Raw materials came in one end, and finished automobiles drove out the other. This was vertical integration on a scale never before attempted. Ford controlled the entire supply chain under one roof. Well, under 9 million square feet of roofs. No waiting for suppliers. No transportation delays. No dependency on external companies. Ford could produce a car from iron ore to finished vehicle in 48 hours. River Rouge wasn't just a factory. It was a monument to Ford's belief that total control meant maximum efficiency. And maximum efficiency meant lower costs. And lower costs meant more accessible automobiles. Everything connected. Everything served the mission. But Ford didn't just think about speed and output. He also thought about the workers who made it all possible. This was early ergonomics, though they didn't call it that yet. Ford's engineers studied worker movements. How far did they have to reach? How much did they have to bend? How many steps did they take in a shift? And then they optimized for minimal strain. Tools were placed within 3 feet of each worker. Everything you needed was within arm's reach. No walking to storage. No hunting for equipment. This reduced walking by 95%. 95%. A worker who used to walk miles per shift now stood mostly in place, focused entirely on their task. Injuries initially rose when the line launched. Workers weren't used to the repetitive motions. But Ford responded with training. Teaching proper techniques. Adjusting workstation heights. Adding brakes. And over time, injury rates fell below what they'd been in the old system. Ford understood something crucial. If workers got hurt, they couldn't work. And if they couldn't work, the line stopped. Taking care of workers wasn't just compassionate, it was practical. The impact of Ford's assembly line rippled far beyond Highland Park. Productivity across the entire American manufacturing sector doubled after Ford demonstrated what was possible. Doubled. Other automakers, General Motors especially, studied Ford's methods and copied them. They had to. You couldn't compete with Ford's output and prices using old manufacturing methods. But Ford maintained his lead through wages. He paid workers $1.33 per hour when competitors paid less. Better pay attracted better workers. Better workers made fewer mistakes. Fewer mistakes meant higher quality and faster production. It was another virtuous cycle. Pay more, get better people, produce better products, sell more cars, make more money, pay more. Ford understood that being cheap with workers was expensive in the long run. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Ford's assembly line was the obsessive measurement. The line would halt for tweaks. Constantly. If engineers noticed a bottleneck, they'd stop production, adjust the station, and restart. Perfection wasn't achieved once. It was pursued continuously. Ford used something called Picard timing cards. These tracked every worker's efficiency down to the second. Not to punish people, but to identify where the system could be improved. If Station 17 consistently took longer than surrounding stations, that was a signal. Maybe the task needed to be split between two workers. Maybe the tools needed upgrading. Maybe the parts needed to arrive differently. Data drove decisions, and decisions drove improvement. This level of precision was unprecedented. Most factories operated on intuition and experience. Ford operated on measurement and iteration. It's one reason why Ford's efficiency gains were so dramatic while competitors struggled to keep up. They were guessing. Ford was calculating. So let's step back and understand what Ford really invented here. The assembly line wasn't just a faster way to build cars. It was a new philosophy of work, a new relationship between humans and machines, a new understanding of how to organize labor and capital and time. Before Ford, manufacturing was about skill. Craftsmen who knew how to do everything from start to finish. After Ford, manufacturing was about systems. Workers who knew how to do one thing perfectly, fitting into a larger process they might not fully understand. This had profound implications, good and bad, that we're still grappling with today. On one hand, the assembly line created incredible efficiency. It made products affordable. It employed thousands of workers. It raised standards of living and made the middle class possible. On the other hand, it reduced skilled craftsmen to cogs in a machine. It made work more monotonous. It prioritized speed over artistry. It created a relationship between worker and product that was fundamentally alienating. Both things are true. Both things matter. But regardless of how you feel about it, the assembly line changed everything. Modern manufacturing, modern logistics, modern supply chains, they all trace back to Highland Park, 1913. Ford didn't just build cars faster. He rebuilt how we make everything. And yet, all this efficiency, all this productivity, all these cars rolling off the line at unprecedented rates, they created a new problem. You could build 1,000 cars per day. But could you find 1,000 people per day who could afford to buy them and work the line? That question would lead Ford to his next revolution, one that was even more controversial than the assembly line itself. The $5 workday. January 5, 1914. Henry Ford called a press conference. Reporters gathered, expecting another announcement about production numbers or a new Model T feature. Instead, Ford said something that made jaws drop. We are doubling our minimum wage. Effective immediately, Ford Motor Company will pay $5 per day for an 8-hour workday. $5 per day. The standard wage for factory workers was about $2.50. Ford wasn't giving a raise. He was giving a revolution. Adjusted for inflation, that $5 daily wage is equivalent to roughly $120,000 per year in today's money. And the impact was immediate. Turnover at Ford's factories had been 90% annually. 90%. Workers would last a few months, then quit because the assembly line work was so demanding and monotonous. After the $5 day, turnover dropped 90%, from near total churn to almost none. Immigrants flooded to Detroit. Word spread, Ford pays $5 a day. You could come to America, work at Ford, and earn more money than you'd ever dreamed of back home. Lines formed outside Highland Park. Thousands of people desperate for a job that paid enough to actually build a life. But there was a catch, and it was a big one. Ford didn't just hand out $5 to anyone who showed up. You had to qualify. And qualifying meant passing inspection by something called the Sociological Department. Yes, Ford created an entire department dedicated to investigating the personal lives of his workers. Investigators would show up at your home unannounced. They'd look around, check if your house was clean, ask if you drank alcohol, inquire about your spending habits, talk to your neighbors about your character. Were you sober? Were you thrifty? Did you save money or waste it? Were you a good family man? Did you attend church? If the sociological department decided you were living properly, by Ford's standards, you got the $5 wage. If not, you got fired. Or you stayed on at the lower wage while they help you improve your lifestyle. Initially, Ford fired about 1/3 of his workforce. 1/3. For not meeting his moral standards. This wasn't just about work. This was about social engineering. Ford believed that if he paid workers enough to live well, he had the right, maybe even the obligation, to ensure they lived well by his definition. It was paternalistic. It was invasive. It was a profound overreach into workers' private lives. And yet, thousands of workers accepted it because $5 a day was life-changing money. You could tolerate inspectors visiting your home if it meant your children ate better, your family had a real house, your future looked brighter. The $5 day was revolutionary and oppressive at the same time. But let's zoom out from the factory floor and look at what 15 million Model Ts did to America itself. Before Ford, most people lived near where they worked. You walked to the factory, or you took a streetcar, or in rural areas, you just lived on the farm where you labored. The Model T changed everything. Suddenly, you could live 5 miles away, 10 miles away. You could commute. This enabled something entirely new. Suburbs. Dearborn, Michigan, Ford's hometown, became one of the first planned suburban communities for workers. Affordable homes with yards, far enough from the city to feel spacious, close enough to drive to work. This model, the suburban worker community, became the blueprint for post-World War II development. Levittown and countless other suburban developments followed Ford's pattern. The American suburb, with its single-family homes, lawns, and car-dependent lifestyle, that traces directly back to the Model T, making commuting practical. Ford didn't just change how we work. He changed where we live. But not all of Ford's labor relationships were about generous wages and suburban dreams. In 1913, even before the $5 day, workers went on strike over the assembly line speed-up. The pace was exhausting. The monotony was soul-crushing. Ford crushed the strike. Swiftly, ruthlessly. And in 1932, during the Great Depression, tensions exploded into violence. The Battle of the River Rouge. Workers marching to protest wage cuts and layoffs were met by Ford's security forces and police. Tear gas, fire hoses, and freezing weather. And then bullets. 4 workers died. Dozens more were wounded. This was the darker side of Ford's empire. He paid well, but he demanded total control. Unions were threats. Worker organizing was rebellion. For years, Ford resisted unionization more fiercely than almost any other industrialist. The United Auto Workers pushed for recognition, and Ford pushed back with hired security, intimidation, and violence. The man who revolutionized wages also fought tooth and nail against workers having a collective voice. It's a contradiction that defined Ford: generous and authoritarian, visionary and controlling, progressive and deeply conservative. But let's return to the $5 day, because its impact went far beyond Ford's factories. Here's what happened. Workers earning $5 a day suddenly had disposable income. Not just enough to survive, but enough to buy things. And what did many of them buy? Model Ts. Ford workers were buying Fords. The people building the cars could afford the cars they built. This wasn't just poetic, it was revolutionary. For the first time in industrial history, the working class wasn't just producing for the wealthy, they were producing for themselves. And it didn't stop with cars. Workers bought radios, furniture, appliances. They went to movies. They took their families out to eat occasionally. This explosion of worker purchasing power helped create modern consumerism. The idea that ordinary working people could and should buy manufactured goods beyond bare necessities. And when workers couldn't afford to pay cash, General Motors created GMAC, General Motors Acceptance Corporation, the first major auto financing program. Buy now, pay later. Ford's $5 day didn't just raise wages. It created the consumer economy that defines modern capitalism. World War I brought another transformation to Ford's factories: women. In 1918, with men off fighting in Europe, Ford hired thousands of women to work the assembly lines. Thousands. Women proved they could handle the work. They could operate the machinery, maintain the pace, meet the quality standards. They weren't just filling in, they were excelling. And then the war ended. The men came home, and Ford, along with most of American industry, fired the women. Just like that. Thanks for your service. Now go back home. There were scandals. Accusations that Ford's hiring of women was immoral, that women working alongside men led to improper relationships. The sociological department, so concerned with workers' private lives, suddenly found women working in factories problematic. It was a missed opportunity. A glimpse of what could be, followed by a retreat to traditional gender roles that would take decades to overcome. The assembly line had room for women, but 1918 America decided it didn't want them there. But perhaps the most profound impact of the Model T wasn't in factories or wages or suburbs. It was in movement itself. Between 1910 and 1930, America paved 300,000 miles of roads. 300,000 miles. Why? Because suddenly people had cars. And cars needed roads. The Model T didn't just enable travel, it demanded infrastructure. Local governments, state governments, the federal government all started pouring money into road construction because voters who owned cars wanted places to drive them. This created tourism. Before the Model T, vacation meant maybe visiting relatives a town over. After the Model T, families could drive hundreds of miles. See the Grand Canyon. Visit national parks. Explore the country. The family road trip became a cultural institution. The freedom of the open road. Seeing America from behind the wheel. Small towns along major routes boomed. Gas stations appeared. Motels. Roadside attractions. Entire economies built around people driving through. The Model T didn't just change transportation, it changed culture. It changed how Americans thought about distance, about leisure, about what was possible on a weekend. There's a story about the $5 day that captures its brilliance. Henry Ford noticed something fascinating. His workers, earning $5 a day, were saving money. And many of them were using those savings to buy Model Ts. Ford was essentially paying workers enough that they became his customers. The $5 he paid out came back to him as car purchases. It was a virtuous cycle. Pay workers well, workers buy your product, sell more products, hire more workers, pay them well, repeat. This seems obvious now, but in 1914, it was radical. Most industrialists saw wages as pure cost, something to minimize. Ford saw wages as investment, something that created demand. Ford plowed those worker savings back into Model T sales, which funded more factories, which employed more workers who earned $5 a day, who bought more Model Ts. It was elegant, self-sustaining, and it proved that you could be profitable while paying workers well. You just had to think differently about what profit meant and where it came from. The labor wars didn't end quickly. Ford resisted unions throughout the 1930s, even as GM and Chrysler eventually recognized the UAW. But by 1941, after years of strikes, protests, and pressure, even Ford gave in. The United Auto Workers won recognition at Ford. 117,000 UAW members at Ford facilities. A complete reversal of Ford's decades-long anti-union stance. And the legacy of the $5 day? It evolved. By the 1940s and 50s, auto workers weren't just earning good wages, they were earning benefits. Health insurance, pensions, paid vacations. The UAW and other unions built on Ford's foundation, arguing that if $5 a day was possible in 1914, then comprehensive benefits and middle-class security should be possible in the post-war boom. Ford's $5 day became the template for the American dream. Work hard, earn a good wage, afford a house and a car, send your kids to college, retire with dignity. That dream, that contract between workers and employers, traces back to January 5, 1914. But Ford's impact wasn't limited to America. The Soviet Union, desperate to industrialize, studied Ford's assembly lines obsessively. Stalin's tractor plants were direct copies of Highland Park and River Rouge. Soviet engineers visited Detroit. They took measurements, drew diagrams, asked questions. And then they went home and built the same systems for tractors, trucks, military equipment. Ford's methods became the foundation of Soviet industrialization. The irony is almost too perfect. The ultimate capitalist teaching the ultimate communist state how to mass produce. And it wasn't just the Soviets. By the 1950s, India and Pakistan had local Ford assembly plants. Japan studied American manufacturing, including Ford's methods, and refined them into what became the Toyota production system. Ford's assembly line didn't just change American manufacturing. It became the global standard. Every industrializing nation looked to Ford's model as the path to prosperity. Mass production, standardization, continuous improvement. These became universal principles, crossing all ideological and geographical boundaries. So let's step back and see what Ford really changed. He didn't just pay workers more money. He created the idea that workers should be able to afford the products they make. He didn't just build suburbs. He created the car-dependent lifestyle that defines modern America. He didn't just resist unions. He showed that even the most powerful industrialist eventually has to recognize workers' collective power. He didn't just enable tourism. He changed how we think about distance, leisure, and freedom. The $5 day was about more than wages. It was about who gets to participate in prosperity, who gets to buy cars, radios, houses, who gets to be middle class. Ford's answer was, everyone who works hard should. That's revolutionary, even if Ford himself was often authoritarian in how he implemented it. The sociological impact of Ford goes beyond what he intended. He wanted to sell cars and run efficient factories. But in doing so, he reshaped where we live, how we work, what we buy, and how we think about the relationship between labor and capital. 15 million Model Ts didn't just move people, they moved society. But every revolution has consequences. Some intended, some not. And as Ford's empire grew, so did the tensions within it. Because building the future is easier than living with what you've built. In 1943, Edsel Ford dies at age 49. Edsel was Henry Ford's only son. He'd been president of Ford Motor Company since 1919, quietly modernating his father's harsh methods, pushing for style and innovation, while Henry remained obsessed with the Model T's utilitarian philosophy. With Edsel gone, the aging Henry Ford, now in his 80s, increasingly erratic, tried to run the company again. It was a disaster. Henry Ford, the man who revolutionized manufacturing, who created the $5 day, who built an industrial empire, had become a tyrant, paranoid, controlling, unable to adapt to a changing world. The company was hemorrhaging money. Market share was plummeting. GM had surpassed Ford years earlier, and now even Chrysler was gaining ground. Ford Motor Company, the pioneer, was dying. Enter Henry Ford II, Edsel's son, Henry's grandson. In 1945, at age 28, Henry II staged what amounted to a family coup. With the support of his mother and the board, he forced his grandfather aside and took control of the company. And one of his first acts? Hire the Whiz Kids, 10 young officers from the U.S. Army Air Forces, trained in statistical analysis and data-driven management. Among them, Robert McNamara, who would later become Secretary of Defense. These men brought something Ford desperately needed: modern management, financial controls, data analysis, strategic planning. Henry Ford had run the company on intuition and authority. Henry Ford II would run it on numbers and systems. It was a bet that the company could be saved through smarter management, even if the founder's genius had faded. The 1950s through the 1970s were complicated for Ford. Some brilliant successes, some catastrophic failures. Let's start with 1964, the Ford Mustang. The Mustang wasn't just a car. It was a cultural phenomenon. Sleek, sporty, affordable. The pony car that made you feel like you were driving something special, even if you were a suburban accountant. Over its lifetime, Ford sold 10 million Mustangs. 10 million. The Mustang became an icon, appearing in movies, songs, and the dreams of teenagers everywhere. In 1943, Edsel Ford dies at age 49. Edsel was Henry Ford's only son. He'd been president of Ford Motor Company since 1919, quietly modernating his father's harsh methods, pushing for style and innovation, while Henry remained obsessed with the Model T's utilitarian philosophy. With Edsel gone, the aging Henry Ford, now in his 80s, increasingly erratic, tried to run the company again. It was a disaster. Henry Ford, the man who revolutionized manufacturing, who created the $5 day, who built an industrial empire, had become a tyrant. Paranoid. Controlling. Unable to adapt to a changing world. The company was hemorrhaging money. Market share was plummeting. GM had surpassed Ford years earlier, and now even Chrysler was gaining ground. Ford Motor Company, the pioneer, was dying. Enter Henry Ford II, Edsel's son, Henry's grandson. In 1945, at age 28, Henry II staged what amounted to a family coup. With the support of his mother and the board, he forced his grandfather aside and took control of the company. And one of his first acts? Hire the Whiz Kids, 10 young officers from the U.S. Army Air Forces, trained in statistical analysis and data-driven management. Among them, Robert McNamara, who would later become Secretary of Defense. These men brought something Ford desperately needed: modern management, financial controls, data analysis, strategic planning. Henry Ford had run the company on intuition and authority. Henry Ford II would run it on numbers and systems. It was a bet that the company could be saved through smarter management, even if the founder's genius had faded. The 1950s through the 1970s were complicated for Ford. Some brilliant successes, some catastrophic failures. Let's start with 1964, the Ford Mustang. The Mustang wasn't just a car. It was a cultural phenomenon. Sleek, sporty, affordable. The pony car that made you feel like you were driving something special, even if you were a suburban accountant. Over its lifetime, Ford sold 10 million Mustangs. 10 million. The Mustang became an icon, appearing in movies, songs, and the dreams of teenagers everywhere. The Mustang proved Ford could still innovate, could still capture the public imagination. But then there was the Edsel. Named after Henry Ford's deceased son, the Edsel was supposed to be Ford's entry into the medium price market. Heavily marketed, extensively researched, and it flopped. Spectacularly. The Edsel became synonymous with failure. Awkward styling, poor timing, launching right before a recession. $350 million lost. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $3 billion. And then there was the Pinto. A small, affordable car for the 1970s gas crisis. Seemed like a smart move. Except the Pinto's gas tank was prone to exploding in rear-end collisions. People died. Lawsuits followed. Ford's reputation took a beating when internal memos revealed they'd calculated that paying wrongful death settlements would be cheaper than recalling and fixing the cars. The Pinto scandal became a case study in corporate negligence, a reminder that cutting costs could cost lives. By the late 1970s, Ford realized they couldn't just focus on America anymore. The world was changing. Japanese and European automakers were gaining ground. So Ford went global. In 1979, they launched the Fiesta in Europe, a small fuel-efficient car that Europeans actually wanted. It worked. Then in the 1980s, Ford formed an alliance with Mazda. This partnership produced the Ford Probe and helped Ford learn Japanese manufacturing techniques, the same techniques that were making Toyota and Honda so competitive. Ford was adapting, learning from competitors, becoming less American-centric and more globally strategic. And by 2008, Ford made a crucial decision: the One Ford plan. For decades, Ford had operated multiple brands: Lincoln, Mercury, Jaguar, Land Rover, Volvo, Aston Martin. Each brand required investment, management, and resources. The One Ford plan was simple: streamline, sell off the luxury brands, focus on Ford and Lincoln, build global platforms that could be sold everywhere. Less complexity, more focus, better efficiency. It was a return to Henry Ford's original philosophy: simplicity at scale. And then came the next revolution, electrification. For over a century, Ford had built gasoline-powered vehicles. That was the business. That was the legacy. But by 2020, the world was changing again. Tesla had proven that electric vehicles could be desirable. Regulations were pushing toward zero emissions. The future was clearly electric. Ford's response? The Mustang mighty. Taking the iconic Mustang name and putting it on an electric SUV was risky. Purists were furious. That's not a Mustang, they cried. But Ford sold 100,000 units. Customers loved it. The Mach-E proved that Ford could compete in the electric future without abandoning its heritage. And then came the big move, the F-150 Lightning. The F-150 has been America's best-selling truck for 48 consecutive years. It's not just a vehicle, it's a symbol of American work, capability, and identity. Making it electric was audacious. Trucks are about towing capacity, range, and reliability. Could an electric truck deliver? The Lightning answered yes. 200 miles of range. $40,000 starting price. Power outlets to run tools on job sites. Even the ability to power your home during blackouts. Ford took its crown jewel and electrified it. That's commitment to the future. But Ford's modern turnaround really began with one man, Alan Mulally. In 2006, Ford was in crisis. Again, they just posted a $12.7 billion loss. $12.7 billion. GM and Chrysler were months away from bankruptcy and government bailouts. Ford hired Mulally from Boeing, an outsider, someone who wasn't steeped in Detroit's culture and assumptions. Mulally did something radical. He told the truth. He gathered Ford's executives and asked each to report on their division status using a color code. Green for good, yellow for caution, red for trouble. In the first meeting, everyone reported green. Everything's fine. Mulally looked around the table and said, "We just lost billions of dollars. Someone must have problems." Eventually, one brave executive reported red, and Mulally applauded him. Literally clapped. Because honesty was what Ford needed. Mulally slashed 40% of Ford's debt. He mortgaged everything, including the blue oval logo itself, to secure financing. He bet big on trucks and SUVs, recognizing that's where Ford's strength lay. And crucially, he resisted the government bailout. While GM and Chrysler took taxpayer money, Ford took loans they could pay back on their own terms. It was a gamble. And it worked. Today, Ford is rebuilding its moats, the competitive advantages that will carry them into the next century. They've partnered with SK on to build Blue Oval SK battery plants. Not just buying batteries from suppliers, building their own production capacity. Vertical integration. Just like Henry Ford with his steel mills. Control the supply chain, control your destiny. Ford's U.S. market share in 2025 sits around 8%. That's not dominant. GM and Toyota are bigger. But Ford is strategically positioned in hybrids, which are outselling pure EVs in many markets. In China, Ford's joint ventures produce over 1 million vehicles yearly. They're not just an American company anymore. They're truly global. And they're investing $50 billion in electrification by 2026. $50 billion. That's a bet the company's scale investment in the electric future. Ford is also testing robot access with Google's Waymo. Autonomous vehicles. The next frontier of transportation. From Model Ts to self-driving EVs. From Highland Park to AI-powered logistics. The technology has changed. The ambition hasn't. And Ford has made peace with labor. Remember the Battle of River Rouge? The decades of anti-union fighting. In 2023, the UAW negotiated a 25% pay increase for Ford workers over the life of the contract. Ford didn't fight it the way Henry Ford would have. They negotiated. They compromised. Because they learned what Henry eventually learned, you can't build cars without workers. And workers who are well-paid and respected build better cars. The $5 Days legacy lives on not in the specific dollar amount, but in the principle that prosperity should be shared. And there's a fascinating full-circle moment. Ford is building EV charging networks across America. Suburban infrastructure for electric vehicles. Remember how the Model T spurred 300,000 miles of paved roads? Now Ford is helping build the charging infrastructure that will enable EV adoption. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The third quarter of 2025 tells the story of Ford's rebirth. $2.5 billion in profits. On the back of hybrid sales, particularly hybrid trucks. While Tesla grabs headlines and pure EV startups struggle, Ford is quietly winning by offering customers what they actually want right now: hybrids. The bridge technology between gas and electric. Ford learned from the Edsel and the Pinto: don't get too far ahead of customers, but don't fall behind either. Meet them where they are and gently lead them forward. The rivalry with Tesla is fascinating. Tesla is the revolutionary. Ford is the incumbent adapting. Elon Musk reinvented the car. Ford is reinventing Ford. Who will win? Maybe both. The market is big enough for a visionary startup and a century-old giant that refuses to become irrelevant. So what's the lesson of Ford's decline and rebirth? Companies, like people, go through cycles. Success breeds complacency. Complacency breeds decline. Decline, if you're lucky and smart, breeds reinvention. Ford fell from dominance in the 1920s to crisis in 2006. That's 80 years of struggle, mistakes, failures alongside successes. But they survived. They adapted. They're still here. Henry Ford revolutionized manufacturing. His grandson saved the company from his father's decline. Alan Mulally navigated the Great Recession. Current leadership is betting on electrification. Each generation faced an existential question: what is Ford for this era? And each generation found an answer. Not always the right answer on the first try. Remember the Edsel, the Pinto. But eventually an answer. Today, Ford is not the dominant force it was in 1920. It's one competitor among many in a global market. But the F-150 is still America's best-selling truck. The Mustang is still an icon. The company that Henry Ford built still employs thousands, still produces millions of vehicles, still shapes how we move through the world. From the Model T to the Lightning. From the $5 day to UAW partnerships. From Highland Park to global manufacturing. Ford has transformed multiple times because transformation was necessary for survival. And maybe that's the real lesson of Henry Ford's legacy. Not that he built the perfect company, but that he built a company capable of evolution. The assembly line wasn't the end of innovation, it was the beginning. A foundation that each generation built upon, adapted, and reimagined. Henry Ford himself resisted change in his later years, nearly destroying what he'd created. But the institution he built was stronger than one man's stubbornness. Ford Motor Company survived Henry Ford. And it will survive long after everyone reading this is gone. Because the automobile revolution that Ford sparked didn't just change how we build cars. It changed how we think about progress itself. Continuous improvement. Efficiency through innovation. Mass production enabling mass prosperity. Those principles, born in Highland Park in 1913, still shape the modern world. The revolution continues. The line keeps moving. And somewhere, you can almost hear the hum of a conveyor belt, pulling the future toward us one piece at a time.